Okay, now we're recording. Yes, I was just going to mention some mistakes I made. One particular that I said something about Immanuel Kant when we were talking about Kant, and I said something about uh, only only ever being able to experience things in your mind. And that's kind of a little bit misleading because that sounds a little bit like Berkeley or something. And that wasn't quite right. It was just a quick slip. I just didn't want anyone to then think that Kant was like Berkeley or something like that. It's rather that our experiences are mind dependent for Kant, right? The structure of your overall experience depends on your mind to be able to create a structure like that. So what I meant is your reality is mind dependent. I did not mean to say that all reality is in your mind. That's not quite what Kant is saying. That was one thing. There was another thing, a very quick thing that was just more of a maybe again no one noticed, but it bugged me that I said it the way that I said it, so I wanted to flag it. I said something about washing hands earlier. Do you remember that? To try to explain, when we look at somebody washing hands, we can have a pretty good guess as to what's going on. In most cases, it's just the person who's washing their hands uh, a regular amount of times, right? The way that it's recommended by health professionals. But then, of course, I wanted to say, well, of course, sometimes someone can have OCD, right? And that's, of course, possible, right? But I said something like, imagine that they're a regular person, not a person with OCD. Okay, that was the bit that bothered me that I put it that way. Maybe nobody cares. I just don't want to sort of imply something like that, like some sort of standard of normality or something like that, right? A regular person can have OCD, right? I'm a pretty regular person, but I've got my problems as well. So I just didn't want to participate in that kind of language or rhetoric that makes it seem as though you're abnormal if you have any sort of thing like that. I think there was some other mistake that I made as well. I cannot remember. There were three things. I should write them down. Just when I'm walking around or running, something will pop in my head, and I'll say, "Well, that wasn't quite right." Maybe I'll think of it later. Okay, well that's it for now. Um, More mistakes later. Today we're going to talk about behaviorism in psychology, but then there's the counterpart in philosophy to behaviorism that we call logical behaviorism. So, what you'll learn in this session is a little bit about behaviorism as a field in psychology and the way that it arose, but then also the way in which philosophers at the same time were taking some of those ideas and having their own little twists on them. Okay? So, logical behaviorism, it's basically a combination of something that in philosophy is called logical positivism. And I'll explain what logical positivism is in this as well. And behaviorism. So when you get psychological behaviorism mixed in with what's called logical positivism, then you get logical behaviorism. Okay, so I'll explain what that means. The picture that I picked here, it's a Rembrandt picture. It's the Feast of Saint Nicholas. So it's a Dutch version of Christmas, um, which I grew up with, by the way, being Dutch. Um, and basically, if we were in class, I'd have you do a little exercise. Um, oh, really? Okay, yeah. You've had the same. Wait, you were born. You grew up in the Netherlands, or you've had Saint Nicholas. You know about the feast. Which one is it? I'm very curious now. What you mean? What you're saying? Same to? Oh, okay. Cool. 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 Yes. Yeah. So yeah, I was born and raised there until I was about 10ish or something like that. Then my recently have been just a divorced mom, remarried an American missionary aid worker who lived in who worked in Africa. So we moved to Niger, Central West Africa, when I was about 10 to 15. And then when I was 15, we moved to Humboldt. I went to Arcata High. Then I went elsewhere. I went to the Bay Area. I went to the East Coast, and now I'm back. In case anybody cares about that stuff. Anyway, the it's a little party, right? It's a little Christmas Eve celebration. And what I would have you do is to look at the picture and try to guess, what sorts of emotional states are involved. And some of them are pretty easy, right? You can tell that the little boy looks sad. The little girl with the doll looks like she's being naughty, maybe. Most of the people look like they're having a good time, right? We can read off people's emotions on the basis of their behavior to a certain extent. Right, that was the point here. And this is a big theme in behaviorism, of course, the focus is all on behavior, right? Why? Well, we'll see why, but the big reason for it is that behavior is something that's publicly observable, right? So if you're going to do science, empirical science through the senses, and you want to study human beings and how they work and what makes them tick, it does seem to make sense that you would look at a person's physical behavior, right? And so that's a big part of what behaviorism is all about. This is one of those annoying things where this is the Prezi that I cannot connect to my phone, so I have to switch over to go to the next part. See what Marlo has to say there. The person on the far left in the picture. Let's see. I thought that was the kid. I thought that was a kid. Yeah, I think it's a little boy, and his face does look. His face looks a little bit. I never really noticed that. The face looks a little bit aged, doesn't it? But it's supposed to be a little boy, I think. That's pretty funny. Okay, so logical behaviorism, like I said, it's just a combination, right, of behaviorism, which you may have heard of already, right, in psychology. A lot of people take a psychology class in high school. Maybe you took a psychology class in college, or maybe you just heard the term behaviorism before. Okay, so you may be somewhat familiar already. Now watch this. Woohoo! That's pretty fun, right? Just go back and forth like that. Okay, so I'm gonna have to stay on the Prezi itself for a little bit, and I'll check back to see if you have any comments. It's hard for me to go back and forth when I don't have it set up on my phone to click to the next. So I'm gonna be on the Prezi, and every couple minutes I'll check to see if anybody said anything. To adjust the box for the recording as well. This is pretty annoying to have to do it like this, but I see no other workaround, so. Okay, so behaviorism in psychology, these are the three big names, Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner. But it's really Watson that started it in 1913, right? So beginning of the 20th century. Right, we finally made it. Well, of course, now we're in the 21st century. In my mind, we're still in the 20th century. So we haven't quite made it yet. This is, over 100 years ago. This guy, James Watson, who has the looks of a silver screen star at the time. He looks like Vincent Price or someone like that. And then developed further by B.F. Skinner, who always reminds me of an old Dwight from The Office. Doesn't he look like that? Okay. But both of them, behaviorism in general, is based in many ways on Pavlov's work. But they really expand it much further than beyond what Pavlov was doing. So Pavlov has what he calls classical conditioning, and this is something you may be familiar with. By the look of his hair, he's familiar with conditioner. So this is the scenario, right? Has everybody heard of this? This is where you pair a stimuli, a set of stimuli where one provokes a certain behavior response, and then once it becomes paired with something else, you just need the one thing, right? So for example, a dog might automatically salivate, might automatically start drooling when they see food. And if you ring a bell, nothing really happens. And there's no automatic behavior response. But now, if you ring the bell every time the dog sees that food, so every time the dog is salivating because of the food, and you ring the bell, eventually you can get rid of the initial stimulus, the food, and you can get the dog to salivate simply by ringing the bell. See that? So you can have automatic responses to a stimulus, like food, and then you can pair that stimulus with another stimulus so that it becomes ingrained in the creature's brain somehow that it is to provide the same sort of automatic response, that it is supposed to cause the same kind of response, so that even when the food is no longer there, the initial stimulus, once you have that paired associated stimulus, you'll still get the response. Now, why is that interesting or cool? Well, it's for one, it's something very scientific that you can do, right? Now, we're not exactly talking about the mind yet as this mysterious phenomenon. We're still here just talking about animals, but still, it's a scientific way of approaching the study of at least animal psychology in a very rudimentary way, right? And you can set up experiments and things like that. You can have actual hard data to rely on. All right, so they take Watson and Skinner take that classical conditioning and expand it more to make it a bit more complex. So it's not just about pairing stimulus to elicit a response, by switching the stimulus in the long run. It gets much more complicated, and I'm not going to go over all of this. But you could take a psych class and you would learn more about all of this stuff. Okay. Basically, all has to do with stimulus response, right? And the idea in behaviorism as a therapeutic approach is that you can change undesirable behavior by thinking about things like stimulus and response. And so this Watson in particular, right? He's somewhat of a contemporary of people like Jung and Freud, but this tries to make psychology more scientific, right? If you read Freud, it's almost like reading philosophy or something like that. It's not quite scientific, right? It's not empirical or rigorous or methodical, or it doesn't really use data. It doesn't use numbers and quantitative analysis. But behaviorism allows you to do that, allows you to actually put numbers to the phenomena. And remember, that's the big deal in science, right? That's why science is so successful, when it has to do with actual empirically observable phenomena that everyone can check on, that we can then put in terms of formulas, where we can use mathematics to express the phenomena that we're talking about. That's what makes good science. And so the less something is like that, the less scientific it is, and the more of a soft science, as it's called, it is. So a lot of psychology is soft science, at least to the extent that it's not being empirical and quantitative. But behaviorism allows you to be empirical and quantitative. Right? So it's an improvement in that sense. Over depth psychology. And here's the big thing about behaviorism. It's a feature and ultimately a bug. It just does not talk about internal mental states. since the researcher can't get at those, right? So the researcher, uh, if you're going to do psychology and you're trying to do it from a scientific point of view, you're doing it from the point of view of the researcher, the point of view of the scientists. The scientist has to deal with observable phenomena, things that the scientist can record and write down. But these sort of internal mental states are not accessible to scientists, right? We talked about this last time, that you can look at my pain behavior, right? You can see me go, ow, okay? That's one thing, but is my pain accessible to you? Is my pain something that you can take a picture of or write down or anything like that? And the intuition that many people get is no, a pain is a private event that's not accessible to anyone except for you, right? And so it is just off limits for empirical research. At least that's a little bit what the idea is in behaviorism. Especially because we're trying to get away from Descartes' immaterial soul that cannot be observed, right? So not only are the behaviorists moving on from people like Freud, they're also trying to get away from this idea of the soul, the mind being this private entity, this immaterial thing that's not amenable to scientific investigation. So in a way, behaviorists are almost like dualists, is that they do not want to talk about the one part. They don't want to talk about those internal mental states, like having a pain or feeling a desire. Those internal ways of feeling are just not accessible to the researcher. The only thing that's accessible to them is your behavior. So that's what they must study. And so that we can simply look at human behavior and look at it with this kind of a model, right? Where the scientists, right, the behaviorist, the scientists can study what kind of stimulus or stimuli the organism is getting from the environment, and they can study the kinds of responses that are provided by the organism in response, right? In response to the stimulus, what kind of behavior is being output? What's going on inside your mind? The behaviorist does not want to talk about that. Right? Some behaviorists will say that's all nonsense. There's nothing going on in your head. You should just study behavior. Some will say, well, as a methodology, we just can't get into that. Yes, you have private pains, but from the point of view of the scientists, we can't get at those. We might as well say that your mind is a black box that we cannot get into. All we can really do is map the inputs to the outputs. In a way, you might think of a cell phone. Right? Suppose the cell phone just appeared out of nowhere and we didn't have any cell phones yet, and we wanted to study the cell phone. But when we try to break it up, when we try to break it to get to the inside, we can't do it. Right? We can imagine the phone is a black box. What can we learn about the phone if we can't get at the hardware? Well, we can at least study the way in which, if I tap this, then this comes up. Then after that, if I tap this and this, then this will happen. Right? We could study the inputs and the outputs. If it were the case that that what's inside the hardware, the software, however you want to talk about it, if that were not accessible to us, but we wanted to do science of a cell phone, right? The only thing we could really do is study the inputs and the outputs. And we could get a pretty good understanding of what this guy can do, right? And the same goes for human beings. When we study inputs and the way that we translate that into behavior, we can learn a lot about what makes human beings tick, and we can match up all these inputs and outputs in various ways, and we can have something that's scientific. But notice that it's at a methodological level, it is simply going to say, we're not going to talk about what's inside the black box, right? First rule of behaviorism, we don't talk about the black box, right? All we can do is study what's actually accessible to the researcher, which is environmental input, the stimulus, and then the response behavior, that's the output. Questions about behaviorism? Are we good on this? You know, you get the general approach, I hope, right? Now, spoilers, behaviorism has kind of gone to the wayside, at least as a complete explanation of psychology, right? It still has therapeutic applications because it does work. It's just a limited domain, right? If we're saying we're not going to talk about mental states, well, you're just sort of like ignoring an aspect of reality. If they're thinking of something sad, yeah, how would that be explicable for a hardcore behaviorist? And that's much more difficult to do on behaviorism. That's one of the problems, and we'll look at that as well. Whereas once we get to something like functionalism, which also has inputs and outputs, but in functionalism, your mental state itself can be an input, right? So it's the same thing is true of this, right? You don't always need an input to get a response. A second ago, I got a notification that said my battery is low, right? That's a little bit like someone thinking about being sad and then suddenly appearing sad. It's something happened on the inside and then a message popped up, right? I got an output because of an internal input, right? Hardcore behaviorism can't deal with that. They can only deal with inputs from the environment. So yeah, then you might say, Parker, that on behaviorism that would not be explainable. But there's ways to get around that because it can be very, very complex. Right? It can be something what's called dispositional, right? Where the behavior might not be apparent right now and the input might not be apparent right now. But you could say that there was some sort of initial inputs that then eventually led to sad behavior, right? But you might still say if you leave out the actual feeling of sadness, you're leaving out something. Right? And that's one of the problems with behaviorism, at least when you interpret it in this very strict way, where it's all about observable phenomena. For that, all you have is behavior and environmental inputs, whereas the actual subjective feeling that we, from a folk psychology point of view, we kind of assume that's part of the picture, right? So some behaviorists will say, yes, that is part of the picture, but we can't do science with it, so we have to ignore it. Others will say, well, you just have confused ideas about mental states. Those things are illusions or something like that. If you think about it in a rigorous scientific way, you would be a behaviorist like us, right? But most people are not convinced by that. Okay, so we have that basic picture of behaviorism. So back to logical behaviorism, right? I talked about behaviorism just in psychology, psychological behaviorism, right? That's Watson, B.F. Skinner, right? Logical behaviorism is a combination of behaviorism and logical positivism. So logical positivism is the big one here that you probably have not heard of. Even if people have vaguely heard of behaviorism, and now you kind of get the basic idea, hopefully. What about logical positivism? That sounds mysterious to most people. However, you'll see that it's actually built on something very, very familiar that we've already learned about. Okay, so logical positivism, early 20th century. Okay, this is This is sort of a movement or a loosely affiliated school of thought uh, that did well in the early part of the 20th century. They're influenced by people like Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's an important philosopher at the beginning of the 20th century. One of the most important philosophers. He wrote two game-changing books. In the first book, he thought he had solved all the problems of philosophy, and he thought he was done, so he got a different job. Then after a while, he decided that he was actually quite wrong, and he wrote another book that also became hugely influential. So it's influenced by his first book, the Tractatus, but also by David Hume, right? David Hume's empiricism, which you should know a little bit about, right? Because we spent some time on David Hume. And basically, the logical positivists, just think of them as Hume's revenge, right? It's basically taking Hume's main idea, or one of his main ideas, that I'll explain in a second, as well as Auguste Comte's positivism. So that's where they get their title, positivism. But it's a logical positivism. These are some of the people. Schlitz and Carnap were part of the initial movement. H.A. Ayer sort of popularized positivism to a wider audience. So his book, Language, Truth, and Logic, it's kind of a bestseller. You can find it in lots of bookstores. It's readable. Schlick, this guy was professor who was shot down by one of his graduate students, right? Murdered on the steps of the university. Pretty crazy. So logical positivists basically go along with the logical positivists basically go along with Hume's basic insight, right? Remember, Hume said that knowledge is either analytic or synthetic, right? If it's analytic, it's just true in virtue of meaning. If it's a synthetic statement, it's something that you have to verify empirically. You remember this, right? And what did Hume say? If it's not either of those, it's just a bunch of garbage, right? And he was talking about a lot of medieval philosophy, a lot of theology, but also a lot of rationalist philosophy. Right? A lot of the claims being made by these philosophers were neither analytic nor empirically verifiable. And according to Hume, then it's just garbage, right? The logical positivists stated this in terms of meaning, right? Logical here has to do with the meanings of terms, right? So it's a thesis about language, the way that the logical positivists framed it. Hume didn't always frame it that way, but the logical positivists were all about language. So they are saying that for true or false statements, right, they're not talking about things like questions, which are not true or false, or commands, right? Shut the door, that's not true or false. Or interjections, right? Like, oh my God, right? Where you're just saying something, just interjecting something. Not like that, right? Rather, for every true or false statement, a true or false statement can only be meaningful in one of these two ways. It can only be meaningful if it's an analytic statement that has to do with the meaning of a term, or if it's a statement that's empirically verifiable, or at least in principle empirically verifiable. And what do I mean by that? Well, look, I can make the statement, there's an alien living on Mars. I can't actually verify that. But it is a meaningful statement because we could conceive of what it would be like. We could imagine getting on a rocket and going to Mars and seeing that alien. Right, so that it's at least conceivably verifiable in some way, that you could test with your senses whether or not a statement is true. Yeah? So along with this then is what's called the verification principle. And that has to do with those synthetic type statements. So leaving behind analytic statements for now, right? Statements that are true just by virtue of meaning, like all bachelors are unmarried, possibly 1 + 1 = 2, right? Depending on who you ask. There's those types of statements, and then there's empirical statements, right? Synthetic statements. They mean the very thing that they're talking about. That sounds confusing, but it's actually not. So, for example, for an empirical statement to be meaningful, for some statement about the nature of reality, right? So, not an analytic statement, but something like water is H2O, or the Eiffel Tower is in France, or there's an alien on Mars, right? Any of those kinds of statements. The cat is on the mat, right? For a statement like that to be meaningful, you have to have some sort of idea in mind of what would confirm or disconfirm the truth of that statement, right? So if I said the cat is on the mat, you only understand that sentence if you know what it would be like for that statement to be true or false. What would you actually have to see to verify the statement? Well, you can imagine it, right? You can imagine a cat on a mat. You can imagine what sort of sensory experience you would have to know that the cat is on the mat, right? That's what makes it meaningful to you, is that you would know that there's some set of observations that would confirm that statement or disconfirm it, right? For any type of statement, right? Or if I said it's sunny out right now, you know what that means. What does you knowing what that means come to? What does that amount to? Well, you know what it would take for that statement to be true or false, and you know what sorts of observations you would need to verify that statement, right? In this case, you would just have to look outside and see if it's sunny or not. We got that? Right. So the meaning of an empirical statement is the very things that you would have to observe to see whether that statement is true, right? So the cat is on the mat means that scenario, right? The scenario that you would see, the scenario that you would be able to observe. That's what that sentence means, right? So sometimes it's called the picture theory of meaning. It's as though each true or false statement is able to give you a picture of what reality would be like if it were true. Right? So to grasp the meaning of a term, or to grasp the meaning of a sentence, a true or false type statement, is to know what sorts of things you would have to observe to see that it's true. So it may sound kind of abstract, but it is really just talking about very everyday kinds of things, right? Again, just another scenario, right? There is a little bit of coffee in this mug. Everybody knows what that means, right? Now, you don't actually see if there's any in there, but you know what it means because you know what it would take for you to confirm or disconfirm it. And look, there's a little bit of coffee in there, right? You're imagining something like that. You know what it would take to confirm that statement or to disconfirm it, right? To show that it's true or not true. It has to do with empirical observations, right? The Eiffel Tower is in France. You'd have to imagine that you know what the Eiffel Tower looks like, and you know that if you went to France, to the right area, you would see it. You'd have a set of observations that would confirm or disconfirm the statement. And this is true for all empirical synthetic statements, right? You see what we're getting at here? So contrast something like the cat is on the mat, you know what set of observations would verify that. Now take something else. This is from Hegel, a kind of a rationalist philosopher, not a very empirically minded philosopher. His reading is very, very difficult, and maybe this sentence is meaningful, but it's just a great example of the kind of thing that the logical positivists were concerned about, right? It says this, right? First, there's cat is on the mat. You can imagine what it would be like for a cat to be on the mat or not on the mat, and then you would know what it would take for the sentence to be true. Here's a different kind of sentence. Spirit as the essence that is self-consciousness, or as the self-conscious essence, which is all truth and knows all actuality as itself, is in contrast to the reality which it gives involved in itself in the movement of its consciousness, initially merely its concept, and this concept, in contrast both to the daytime of the development of the night of its essence and to the existence of its moments, as self-sufficient shapes, is the creative secret of its birth. Now, to be fair, maybe that's totally meaningful, okay, if you unpack it all. But the logical positivist is going to say, well, is it meaningful or not? The test is there some set of observations that would verify the statement? Is there some set of observations, things that we could actually see in the world, empirically observe, that we can all agree on, that would show this statement to be either true or false? If there are no scenarios like that, no imaginable scenarios, then the statement is meaningless. You know, another favorite example was Martin Heidegger. Was another sort of continental philosopher that the logical positivists did not like. Heidegger said something like, "The nothing noths." Right? Nothing, like the concept of nothingness, right? And Heidegger would seem to talk about it as though nothing were a type of thing that does something. It noths, right? When you're reading philosophy, you might get really wrapped up into all this language, and it might seem very fun and exciting, but is it actually meaningful? Does it actually mean anything? The logical positivists were convinced that the history of philosophy is just a lot of meaningless, empty talk. Very jargony, it sounds cool, maybe some of it has some sort of intuitive appeal to it, but when it comes down to it, a lot of these types of philosophical statements are not even in principle empirically verifiable, and they're not just definitions. So what they really are is perhaps a type of poetry or something like that, right? So the logical positivist would have been fine with poetry. Poetry is supposed to make you feel a certain way, right? Poetry is not about stating exact scientific truths that are verifiable in some way. So it's fine to write like that, but call it poetry. Don't call it philosophy. Don't call it knowledge. Don't call it truth, right? Truth, according to the logical positivists, is something that attaches to statements. Statements are true if they correspond to the way the world actually is, and they're false if they do not correspond to the way that the world is, and they're only meaningful if we can make that distinction. If we can say, well, this is what it would be like if that sentence was true, this is what it would be like in our experience if the sentence was false. If we have nothing like that, then you're dealing with nonsense. You could imagine a cat on a mat, a verifiable statement. Let's see. You can imagine a cat on a mat. Well, yeah, it would just depend on whether or not you think that there are any verification conditions for that, right? So I don't know what the answer to that is. It may be because you're talking about imagination, something like that, that the behaviorists, or sorry, the logical positivists, if there are no verification conditions for that, then it would be meaningless, okay? But it also kind of depends on how well you can empirically verify something like that, right? So if you means the general you, if I say most people can imagine a cat on a mat, you could simply say, ask people, is that true? Right? I could ask you. Right? That's one verification condition. I could get the experience of you saying, yes, I do know how to do that. And I could get the experience of another person saying, yes, I know how to imagine a cat as well. Right? So we could go on people's words. That's part of their behavior, is their language. It's a whole other problem of skepticism to then say, well, do we know that they're speaking truly? But that's a specific problem. That's skepticism that arises in any field, right? So I would say for a logical positivist, they would say something like, yeah, you could, saying that someone can imagine a cat on the mat, there are verification conditions for that. It would be something like someone tells you that they're able to do it. There might still be problems there, though, okay? And you might end up with some cases that logical positivists would rule out, whereas you might want to rule it in, right? It's possible, you know. But here the idea is you get their basic general idea here, right? Which is that for any true or false statement, unless it's an analytic statement, for any other true or false statement, for it to be meaningful, there has to be some sort of verification conditions. Verification conditions is just what would you have to be able to observe in order to verify or falsify the statement. So it all comes down to experience, right? Logical positivism is extreme empiricism. Logical positivists are empiricists, right? And again, they're taking after Hume, right? They're basically saying exactly what Hume is saying, but they're not buying Kant, right? They're not buying Kant's way of getting out of it. This synthetic a priori, that's not a category for the logical positivists. So yeah, logical positivism, right? Think of the time, early 20th century, looking back. Again, it's a little bit like Hume, right? Just looking back and seeing all the success of the sciences, but even more so than what Hume was able to see. And then looking back and looking at all the philosophy that came after Kant sort of made everyone feel okay again about metaphysics, right? Remember, David Hume, it seemed as though he had destroyed the possibility of doing metaphysics in a philosophical a priori way, right? On Hume's view, the only kind of metaphysics you can do, metaphysics being the study of reality, right, is science, right? That's the only kind of metaphysics that's respectable for Hume. But then Kant said, no, we can do a priori synthetic. We can still do metaphysics. And so then people, you know, especially on mainland Europe, people like Hegel that I mentioned, there's a lot of other philosophers as well that came after Kant and that were influenced by Kant who thought, okay, well, we can still do philosophy, armchair philosophy. We can still just sit at a desk and think great thoughts and come up with these whole systems and ideas and all this stuff. The logical positivists were saying, cut it out. You're doing glorified poetry, that's all. If you want knowledge, study math or be a scientist, okay? Philosophy has nothing more to say about the nature of reality in this way, right? The best the philosophy can do is to try to make sense conceptually out of what science is telling us, what math is telling us, or what our ordinary life or our ordinary concepts are telling us, and try to put it all together in a coherent way. But the type of philosophy that Kant inspired, like we just saw in that Hegel quote, the logical positivists thought that was just a bunch of nonsense. Religious ideas would be part of this as well. There's a lot of religious statements, statements that religious believers think are true, but they're not analytic, and there's no even in principle verification conditions for it. So it tries to make philosophy more scientific. Oh, let me not go yet. Okay, so you get the basic gist of logical positivism, hopefully. Back to Hume, basically, very critical of other traditions in philosophy, right? Any kind of statement that is not in principle empirically verifiable or just an analytic statement is just nonsense, right? So that's a lot of history and philosophy, and it's a lot of religion is like that as well. And some even argue that ethical statements are like that, moral statements, like it is wrong to kill babies for the fun of it. Right? I have to always say, that, you can always come up with some scenario where it's morally justifiable perhaps to kill someone, right? There are scenarios like that. We'll look at that when we look at ethics. But just a general blanket claim, right? Little kids, it's wrong to torture them just for your own gleeful pleasure, even if that makes you happy, right? It's wrong. I think we all agree with that, right? At least intuitively. It's wrong. Okay. What set of conditions would verify that statement? Right? If you can do it, it's at least difficult to do, right? What makes that statement true, that it is wrong to kill or to torture children for fun? We find it intuitively true, right? It's something that you might live your life by, but can you give any sort of empirical grounding for it? Difficult to do. So in fact, this is actually a criticism of logical positivism, right? You could look at it two ways. You could say, well, logical positivism implies that there are no moral truths, but there are moral truths, so logical positivism is wrong. Would you want that to happen to you? Yeah. But again, how does that have any kind of moral authority in the way that we want it to have? You got Socrates. Yeah. Well, we will look at ethics, right? So we'll revisit this whole area, this whole conundrum of ethical statements. What makes them true or false? Yeah. But here the point is, some people thought, at least, that logical positivism would rule them out as meaningless type of statements. This is why some logical positivists would say, yeah, that's right. When you're saying torture is wrong, it looks like it's a true or false statement, but it's actually a disguised command. You're really saying, hey, don't torture. Right? Notice, hey, don't torture, does not have a truth value to it. So it does not have the same kind of problem. It doesn't have to pass the logical positivist tests, because that's only about true-false statements. But there's other uses of language apart from making true-false statements. And when you command something, you're not making a true or false statement. You're simply telling someone to behave a certain way. So some logical positivists thought, yeah, ethical statements are actually like that. They're commands, right? When you say torture is wrong, it's really a way of saying you should not engage in that behavior, or don't engage in that behavior. Don't do that. Yeah, the net positive. Yeah, that's utilitarianism, or some form of consequentialism, Parker. We will look at that. And yeah, there are famous counterexamples to that, right? Like you could imagine Socrates being the one that comes up with a counterexample. Yeah, we will look at that. Yeah. Okay. So that's logical positivism, right? That's its own sort of field. It did die out for various reasons, and we'll get to those at the end. But it was a very influential movement for a little bit of time, for a small amount of time. It's very, very influential, and you can see that it's very unforgiving, and it's very strict, right? It's got to either make complete logical sense, where you can prove it with some sort of system, like in logic or in math, right? Or it has to be very rigorously scientific, or at least very empirically observable, at least in principle. There has to be some sort of set of observations that could confirm or disconfirm your statement, right? Which is difficult to do with certain types of statements, right? Certain types of statements, it's difficult to do that. Like, for example, right? Hume had this problem with causation, right? Every event has a cause. We want to say that that's true, but yet at the same time, it is not an analytic statement, and it's not empirically verifiable, because we don't actually notice everything, right? We don't actually know, for example, what will happen in the future. Now, of course, that does not make it meaningless, of course, because in principle, right, if you had the mind of God, you could see all the events that happen in the world, then at least it's in principle verifiable. So maybe that's not a good example. But the Hegel quote or any other kind of stuff from these philosophers or any kind of religious statements, I've used the Trinity as an example before, right? That God is three people in one. What can we imagine what sorts of experiences would actually verify that for sure? Yeah, Park. Yeah, I mean, I think you could. A lot of times in philosophy, when you do ethics, we look at a lot of borderline cases where we're not sure, and a lot of times people forget about all the cases that don't seem borderline at all to most people. Yeah, I actually like to focus on those more because it can make people think that ethics is just completely subjective and up in the air because we have these fringe cases where we can't decide. When in fact, most of the time, we're all going to be in agreement. At least that's what I think. Okay, so now let's combine logical positivism with behaviorism. Okay, so there was a logical positivist, Carnap, who suggested this as a way of dealing with philosophy of mind. And then Gilbert Ryle, who was an ordinary language philosopher, so he focused on language in the way that we ordinarily use it. And so he actually thinks that the way that we learn language and the way that we use it is actually based on observation of behavior. The way that we learn mental terms like imagining or believing or whatever, we actually learn those terms by observing people's behavior, right? And so what logical behaviorism is, just like positivism, it's a semantic theory about the meanings of certain types of statements. Right? So it's not about what exists, and it's not really about the nature of the mind even. It's kind of a weird approach. It's a completely linguistic approach. It's a theory about the language that we use when we say she's in pain, or I forgot where I put my keys. Right? Words like forget, pain, or I can imagine what it would be like for a cat to sit on a mat. Right? Imagine. It's a mental term. Those mental terms all have their meaning. Right? They're meaningful terms. What gives them their meaning? That's what logical behaviorism is about. What is the meaning of mental terms? Well, it's going to take that verification principle from the positivists and say the meanings of statements about mental states are their verification conditions. So in the same way that the meaning of the statement the cat is on the mat, its meaning is the observations that you would have to verify it or disconfirm it, right? Namely, having visual experience of a cat, right? That's what that statement means. It's what you're able to observe that either corresponds to that statement or does not correspond to that statement. So it's the same thing for mental states. It's the verification conditions, right? So how do you know that's, if I say she's in pain, what does that mean? Well, it would mean that you know what kind of behavior would confirm that or disconfirm that. Right? So if you see a person sitting there just hanging out, just laughing, and I say, she's in terrible physical pain right now, you would most likely say, well, that it doesn't look like it, right? Now, you could still have skeptical scenarios, but for the most part, the way that you understand the meaning of the words or the sentence, she's in terrible pain, you would expect some sort of behavior that corresponds to what I just said. Or else, how would I even know it? Or why would I even say it, right? It could be, pain behavior, like, or the person could be telling you in their own words, oh man, I'm in so much pain right now. Some people can be very, very calm, right? And simply report. I've had that before, where something really hurts, but for some reason you're not freaking out, and you just go, oh man, that really hurts. Okay, that would be a verification condition. That's fine, right? So the meanings of these type of statements, when we talk about people's mental states, it consists in its verification conditions. So she's in pain, it just means whatever it is that you would see, right? What would you observe to confirm that statement? So statements about mental states, right? So the language that we use when we talk about a person's mental states, it's ultimately just about that behavior or the potential behavior, because that's the only thing that we have publicly available to us. So you can again think about a child learning the meaning of a word. It has to, if they're going to learn that pain refers to some objective thing out there that they can actually learn the word pain in this way, it would be by seeing people's pain behavior and then those people using the word pain, right? So you start, it's that stimulus response thing, like it's almost the Pavlov's dog thing, right? You get these two stimuli and then you make a connection between them, right? Okay, pain is what they use whenever they act in this way, so now I know what the word pain is. Now, that's not really how children learn language. I'm sort of like, making it, simplifying it, but it's something like that. Children see a cat, and the adults use the word cats to talk about that publicly observable phenomena, cats, and the child learns the word cat. Now it knows there's a cat would have to mean there's some sort of observation that would confirm or disconfirm that, and I know what that's like. It would be if I see this cat creature. Same goes for mental terms, like she's in pain, Jimmy wants a beer, right? All those types of terms, you learn them by attaching the word to some sort of behavior that you've noticed. And so that's what those words actually mean, according to logical behaviorism. So statements about mental states, if I say she's in pain, it does not actually refer to, this is the part that's weird, right? To that, what I want to say, there is this phenomena of an inner private subjective state, like the feeling of the pain, right? But according to logical behaviorism, at least certain ways of articulating it, those statements are not actually about those inside feelings. When I say she's in pain, it cannot actually refer to that, because that's not something that I have any kind of empirical access to, not even in principle, right? I simply cannot know whether or not you have this inner subjective state or not. That's only privately accessible to you. So it's a weird, do you see how this is working? We're sort of using language as a way to talk about this stuff, right? So the idea is that our mental language that we use refers to behavior in some way, some potential or actual behavior, because that's how we come to know those terms, and that's how we check to see whether or not a statement about someone's mental state is true or false, right? That's all we have to go on is behavior. So it's the behavior which ultimately determines the meanings of mental terms, mental words, words like feel, imagine, perceive, remember, all those terms that we've looked at. Just to head off a quick objection that you might have, mental states can be dispositional. Okay, so for example, if I'm talking about my buddy Randy who wants a new car, there might be nothing in Randy's current behavior which shows that. But it would rather be something like, well, I know what that would mean. Randy wants a new car. That would be true if, for example, let's say Randy had money for a car, could afford one, right? There's no reason for him to not get one. Then he would get one, right? So it's a disposition. We're still talking about behavior. It might not be a current behavior, right? Or if you say, I like ice cream, right? You don't have to verify that I'm eating ice cream right now. It just means that in some cases I would get ice cream and you would see me enjoy it, right? Something like that, some potential behavior. So it doesn't always have to be whatever's happening right there at the moment. But the point is that in order for our words to have any meaning at all, they have to be attached to objective phenomena that are occurring for everyone to see. That's how language can arise. It cannot arise out of these inner subjective states that are just private, because you never know if we're attaching the same word, right? This is Wittgenstein's beetle in the box analogy. I won't get into that, but the basic idea is if a word like pain only referred to this inner subjective states, and I can never verify that you have the same states, we could never have a common use. We can never have a common word pain, because it's referring to these private things that we can't verify that we're talking about the same thing. Whereas if we just say, no, pain refers to what's publicly available, that's how language arises. It cannot arise with reference to purely subjective states. It has to be with reference to something that we can all observe. That's how language evolves. That's how we can have these terms, these words with publicly available meanings that we can all agree what they mean. And so that could only refer to our physical behavior in some way, even if it's in a very complex way. The idea is that a word like pain or a word like desire, these have to ultimately refer to what's publicly observable to everyone. That's simply how language works, right? So the meaning of a mental statement, a statement that attributes a mental state to someone, are going to only refer to behavior. Okay, so everyone see that? Kind of weird. Also kind of makes sense in terms of learning a language, right? I would say to this that, well, can it be both? You know, isn't the inner subjective feeling of pain often accompanied by those publicly observable signs? And so doesn't pain end up still referring to that inner subjective thing as well, to some extent? Yeah. But here the idea is that no, language meaning is determined by verification conditions. Only behavior is a verification condition. Only behavior shows us through the senses what term we could apply to them, right? So if we see someone engaging in pain behavior, then we say they're in pain, and that's what pain refers to. So I'm saying on the one hand, it makes a bit of sense. On the other hand, it is kind of tricky and weird how now we've left behind the feeling of pain completely. That's weird, right? Yeah. So before we get into the criticism, what's good about logical behaviorism? Well, it does make philosophy of mind more scientific, right? At the very least, it's going to scare people into being much more rigorous in their language. And hopefully people will avoid the kind of highfalutin language that we saw in Hegel and Heidegger and people like that, who end up talking, they use a lot of jargon and stuff like that. At the very least, maybe we'll be a little bit more careful about that and ground everything in actual scientific data, right? So we know things, we don't just use our intuition like Kant did, right, to talk about the mind, but we can actually be more scientific. So that's a good thing. And I also think it's interesting, this cognitive development, this point about language, that it is true, right? You couldn't really have a word like pain if all you had going for it was that inner experience. Right? How would you ever have a word that we can all use at the same time, where it has some sort of constant meaning that we're all aware of? That would not be possible if pain was this purely subjective, purely private thing. We would never develop a word pain, right? That would only be possible if we can somehow link it to behavior. Now, I happen to think that when wrong by saying that it's only the behavior then that counts, right? I kind of tend to think, well, the behavior is coupled with the experience, you know. But it is true that we don't experience someone else's experience of pain. We can only experience their behavior. And so that's how we learn the words. But I think eventually you do get that inner feeling as well as part of that. Because, you know, you start to notice you engage in pain behavior and people use the word pain, right? Again, imagining a child learning the word pain. The child does not just notice other people's pain behavior and then people using the word pain. A child can also notice when they're engaging in pain behavior, the grown up says, "Oh, does that hurt? Is that painful? Where's the pain?" You know, that sort of stuff. The child will start to learn the word pain, perhaps with reference to their behavior, but of course they're going to notice whenever I engage in this behavior, I also feel this certain way. Right? So eventually I think pain gets to mean the inner thing as well as the outer behavior. And so then eventually when you're an adult, say at this point, just to fast forward, and I say she's in pain, I tend to think I'm no longer just talking about their experience. That's how I know about it, but I know through experience that pain behavior is usually associated with this awful feeling on the inside that I don't actually feel, but it is there, right? There's more to the person than their behavior. That's where I fall on this, right? So something right, but perhaps being a little bit too exclusive. But you could see how if you're a committed logical positivist, something like this might have to follow. And it provides some answers to these other problems that we had, the mind body problem. How is it that the mind and the body interact, right? Or just put it in terms of mental causation. How is it possible for me to have a desire to lift my hand and then my hand goes up? How is that causation possible? Well, that's pretty easy because on logical behaviorism, unlike dualism, behaviorism doesn't say that there's an immaterial soul. There's just a body behaving. So that's all you really need. It's just a physical system. So ultimately, it's going to be the same as any other physical system. You can explain it entirely in terms of its constituents, in terms of its components, right? So there just wouldn't be any problem. There's only a problem if you think that the mind is a separate kind of reality, right? Here, we have nothing but physical reality. There's no immaterial reality being talked about at all. So there's no problem there. There's also the problem of other minds, which is a skeptical problem, right? It's the idea that, sure, I can see you behaving in a certain way, but how do I know that you really have this inner life like I do? How do I know you really feel pain, right? How do I know that you're not just a zombie, right? We're going to talk about zombies more later. This is a general philosophical problem, right? It leads to positions like solipsism, the idea that perhaps only you exist. Right? We saw that Descartes ended up in a kind of a solipsistic position before God helped him out of that, right? So there's this general problem about other minds. Minds seem to be these hidden things, and I don't know if you really have them. Logical behaviorism says, when you're talking about a mind like that, that's nonsense. Because that kind of a mind is not empirically verifiable even in principle. Right? Mind must refer to a kind of a set of behaviors in a very complicated way perhaps, but that's all mind can really refer to. So there's no problem about, do you really have a mind not accessible to me? No, that's just a nonsense kind of question, right? I can simply observe your behavior and use my ordinary language to talk about it. When I observe you in pain, it's appropriate for me to say you are in pain. That's what the word pain means. It's referring to that type of behavior. That's the end of it on behaviorism. Whereas if you think that pain is this private subjective event, then I might not ever know that you're in pain. Right? You see the problem? So it solves a couple of problems. I'm going through things pretty quickly. I want to be done on time today. So hopefully it's not too fast. Of course, there's objections to this whole approach. You can probably guess them. If we had an actual in-class discussion, I would ask you. Right? The main one being this one that I've already brought up. Doesn't it seem that pain doesn't just refer to the behavior? Right? That's the thing about pain. It hurts, right? That's what makes it suck. That's what makes it terrible. It's not like, oh no, I'm engaging in pain behavior. No, it's, oh no, this hurts. And you don't feel my pain. You don't feel my pain. You don't know. I feel this pain. I'm not just talking about my behavior, right? It does seem to be that way, doesn't it? Right? It seems to be a big objection. That they want to say that pain must mean only those verification conditions, which are only given in a person's behavior. Yet at the same time, it does not seem to scan entirely correctly. That when I say I'm in pain, I'm really referring to a set of behaviors or potential behaviors. Whereas it seems as though I'm talking about the pain, the ouchy thing, right? So that's one objection. There's also this problem that it does seem to be the case, no matter how much the behaviorists, or the positivists rather, want to say that this is nonsense, it does seem to be the case that you alone really know what your immediate mental states are, right? You have privileged access. I could guess that you're in pain if you're engaging in pain behavior, but you know directly, right? Are you feeling that pain or not? You don't look at your own behavior to see if you are in pain. You simply feel the pain. This is where that old joke about the behaviorists is appropriate here, right? You have two behaviorists in bed after the act, and the one behaviorist says, "That was great for you. How was it for me?" Right? Because on a behaviorist point of view, the other person would be able to tell purely on your behavior, right? You can't just tell how good it is for yourself, right? Because it's all based on behavior. Right? The point of the joke is that behaviorism is making a kind of a mistake here, right? You can simply check to see whether you are in pain. You don't have to look at your own pain behavior. And only you can really do that, right? And so this is a problem for logical behaviorism, because it makes it seem as though there's more to mental states or mental terms than just the behavior that we use to judge whether it's there or not. What had just happened here? That's weird. It's not supposed to do that. It's possible, isn't it possible that you have mental states with no corresponding behavior at all? Like actual or potential? That's certainly a possibility. I mean, you can imagine a person in a coma who spends the last 5 years of their life in a coma and then die. Is it really nonsense to wonder? I wonder if they have dreams. I wonder if this person in the coma ever has dreams or some sort of experience in their coma. It doesn't seem like a nonsense question, right? Even though there's no corresponding behavior at all that could verify it, even in principle. Although I will say, perhaps there is, right? Maybe if you could say, well, if they woke up, maybe they could tell you something like that, right? So maybe there's a way of getting out of this. But the idea is that it's intuitively, you could have a mental state with no behavior at all attached to it. And if that's the case, then logical behaviorism is, again, missing out on something that's there, right? That's a possibility. One of the big problems is that you can't even really describe human behavior without already assuming the presence of some sort of mental state. Okay? to describe human behavior without reference to mental states is just about impossible. You know? Imagine, for example, just a normal scenario where, let's say Randy's a fictional person. I don't know anyone named Randy, but let's suppose Randy is my roommate, okay? And Randy is going into the kitchen, rummaging around, looking for some pasta. Looking in all the cupboards. Where's that pasta? Right? Already, how would you describe their behavior without assuming any type of inner mental state? Right? You could talk about their body positions at each moment in time as they're going into the kitchen, but then you wouldn't really be describing the fact that they're looking for pasta. Right? Going into the kitchen to look for pasta sounds like it's just a purely behavioral thing, but you already have to assume that Randy has a desire to find pasta. Yeah, you have to assume that Randy has beliefs about where the pasta is. Right? You have to ascribe all these mental terms to even describe the behavior. So what the logical behaviorist wants to do is to reduce everything down to statements about behavior. Right? That ultimately statements about mental states are really just statements about behavior. You try to do that, you try to describe someone's behavior only, you still end up having to talk about mental terms like intentions. Right? For example, what if I mimicked Randy's motions exactly, right? But I am not looking for pasta. I am trolling Randy. I'm making fun of him, right? I'm doing it as he's doing it. I'm also going into the kitchen and engaging in the same physical surface behavior. But my behavior is different from Randy's because my intentions are different. I am not actually looking for pasta. My intention is to make fun of Randy. Right? So kids do this, right? They copycat, and it's very annoying for the other person. So I could be engaging in all the same surface physical behaviors as Randy, but our behaviors are actually different, and we have to distinguish between the two. How do we do that? Not with reference to the physical behavior that everyone sees, but rather with reference to my intentions, which is a purely mental state. My intentions and my desires and my beliefs. So it ends up being very difficult to try to reduce everything down to just purely physical bodily behavior. Because how would you do that? The only way you would really do that is to use like Newtonian physics or something to describe each molecule on my body and where it is in space at any given time. But that's not going to be meaningful to anyone, right? That would not allow us to distinguish between me and Randy, where our physical behavior is exactly the same, but it's our underlying intentions that are different. And then finally, well, let me see, is it finally? Yes, it is. Last point, logical positivism itself came to an end, okay? And with it, so did logical behaviorism to a large extent. The problem with logical positivism, aside from it just not being in fashion anymore, the main point seems to be, or the main point is, that there seems to be a problem with the verification principle itself. Okay. Remember, the verification principle says every meaningful statement is either analytically true or, in principle, empirically verifiable. That's the statement, right? That's a statement, isn't it? It's a statement itself. Let me say the statement again, right? Every meaningful statement must either be analytic or synthetic, where there's these verification conditions, right? So you either have to be able to prove something analytically or logically or mathematically, or you have to be able to show empirically that something is true, right? Or at least be able to imagine what sort of scenario would falsify it or what scenario would verify it. Now apply the test to that statement itself. Apply the verification principle to the verification principle. Is the verification principle an analytic truth? No, it is not. If you analyze the statement, it's not something that's just true by definition. Is the verification principle something that you can verify empirically, at least in principle? Well, what set of observations would verify or falsify the verification statement itself? The verification principle itself? It's very hard to imagine what could possibly count as empirical confirmation or disconfirmation of the principle itself. Right? So it does not pass its own test is the problem, or at least that's the problem that people have pointed out. Yeah. Which I don't like, because I actually love the verification principle. Because for me it's more of a, well, what other possibility is there, right? I don't know that there's a synthetic a priori like Kant thought. Anyway, most people seem to be in agreement in philosophy now, in contemporary philosophy, in history of philosophy. Most people are not logical positivists or logical behaviorists, because they see the verification principle, which is at the heart of positivism, they see it as being self-refuting. It does not pass its own test. It is not meaningful by its own standards. It's not meaningful because it's not an analytic statement, and it's not a synthetic statement that's in principle verifiable. So what do you do, right? If your central thesis is self-refuting, then the whole approach just falls apart. Right? So apart from the problems that I just mentioned, right, all the individual specific parts, in general, this approach to philosophy of mind has fallen out of favor because logical positivism itself has fallen out of favor. You know? Okay, I'm just going to stop it there because we're right about at time. If you have any questions or comments, this concludes logical behaviorism. I went through it faster than I normally do. I hope that's okay. I hope you're able to follow along. Yeah, if you have any other objections or counterpoints to any of the objections, right? This stuff always goes back and forth. I have to stop somewhere. But, there are still people who might consider themselves logical positivists who might be able to respond to some of these things, right? I have to stop somewhere, right? So just in summary, right, we're doing philosophy of mind, but logical behaviorism does this in an interesting, funny way. It does not really talk about what the mind is like or what the importance of the brain is, any of that stuff. It just talks about the language of the mind, right, of mental terms. What does the language refer to? And their point is, it can only refer to behavior. So it's a way of trying to get out of the metaphysical problems, right? They're trying to not even do metaphysics. Of course, they end up doing it because behavior itself is still something that you're describing as part of reality. So it's a type of metaphysics anyway. But the point being here, logical behaviorism is ultimately a semantic theory. It's a theory about language, and particularly that part of language which has to do with the way that we characterize people's mental states, whether they're in pain, whether they believe something, desire something, sense something. They're saying those terms have a referent. The only referent they could have, because they're part of a language that we all share, it would have to be something that's shareable publicly, which ultimately is just behavior. Okay, done.